a poor flower arranger who for 2 years had not dared move her hands in the language that once bound her to her deaf father, because the last thing she ever said to him with those hands was something cruel, and he passed away before she could apologize. Until the night she realized that the mother of the most powerful crime boss in Chicago was also being buried alive behind that same silence. A mother whom even her powerful son longed to grow close to. A son who tried day and night to mend things between them, yet remained utterly helpless because he had never understood how to cross the wall of silence standing between mother and child. And she understood that saving this stranger might be the only way to redeem what she had failed to do for her own father. What she did not know was that the moment she raised those hands above the dinner table, she had also bound her own fate to the most dangerous man in the city, a man who, once he considered someone his, would never let go. Before we begin the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to support us. We wish you an enjoyable time with the story. Room 7 at the Cecilia always carried a scent Nora Vance could never forget. The scent of white flowers mingling with cigarette smoke, sweet enough to steal the breath from her lungs, then turning bitter at the back of her throat, as though the room itself were trying to conceal something beneath its veil of expensive perfume. It was the most secluded private room in the restaurant, cut off from the outside world by 2 oak doors so thick they swallowed every sound. And every Thursday night, when the gleaming black cars came to a silent stop outside the entrance, the entire kitchen staff suddenly fell mute, lowering their heads and polishing glasses that were already spotless, simply so they wouldn't have to look up at anyone. The Vitale family had arrived. No one needed to say a word. Every pair of eyes avoided that door, and only Nora continued toward it with her vase in her arms, because she needed this job so desperately that there was no room left inside her for fear. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, cradling the vase of pure white gardenias against her chest, as though it were the last fragile thing remaining in her life, and stepped into the midst of people whose names made the entire city of Chicago shudder. Inside, 6 men sat around a long table covered in white linen, their tailored suits fitted closely over broad shoulders, their faces cold and unreadable, and at the head of the table sat Lucien Vitale, a man about whom she had heard every manner of rumor, but had never dared to look at directly. He didn't resemble the crime bosses in the movies, with their slicked-back hair and glittering jewelry. He was lean and hard, with black hair already touched by silver at the temples, even though he was far too young to be going gray. Pale amber eyes sunk deep from lack of sleep, and long fingers slowly turning an old watch around his wrist, as though the motion were the only habit keeping him awake. Nora slipped between those broad shoulders, placed the vase on the small shelf against the wall, removed the wilted flowers from the previous day, and replaced them with fresh gardenias still beaded with dew. Throughout it all, not a single person in the room looked at her, not because they despised her, but because to them she simply didn't exist. She was a silent shadow that came and went, no more remarkable than the wall, the tablecloth, or the dim yellow light falling across the faces of men, discussing things she was doing everything in her power not to hear. They spoke of shipments, of names, of numbers she knew she would be safer knowing as little about as possible, so she kept her head bowed and concentrated on each flower stem, allowing her hands to perform the familiar task without thought. And then it happened, the very thing she had spent 2 years trying to bury. When one of the men asked the person beside him in a low, gravelly voice whether he was certain, Nora's hands, entirely against her will, lifted slightly into the air, her fingers automatically curling into a shape so familiar it hurt, the sign for certain that her father had once taught her, the word he always asked her to repeat whenever she interpreted something important for him. She realized what she was doing in a fraction of a second, and her hand froze halfway through the motion, suspended in the air like a bird whose wing had been shattered by a bullet, before slowly dropping to her side and clenching so tightly that her nails pressed into her palm. Her heart pounded violently, and a cold shiver traveled down her spine, because for 2 years she hadn't allowed her hands to speak that language. For 2 years, every time they moved that way, she saw her father's face, saw the wounded look in his eyes on that final night, and she had sworn to herself that she would never let them speak again. Holding her breath, she glanced around the room and prayed that no one had noticed. And indeed, no one had. Not one person in that room filled with powerful men had bothered to look in her direction, everyone except the silver-haired woman sitting silently to Lucian Vitali's right, a woman whose presence Nora hadn't even noticed until that moment, and whose eyes, deep and strangely alert, were now fixed intently on the hands that had just gone still. The woman's name was Isadora Vitale, and Nora recognized it even before anyone told her, because there was a loneliness surrounding the older woman that she knew all too well, the same kind of loneliness she had lived with throughout her own childhood. Isadora sat there, small against the high-backed leather chair, her silver-white hair neatly gathered into a bun at the nape of her neck, a deep wine-colored shawl draped over her shoulders, worn with age yet undeniably elegant. Her face was unnaturally still, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of someone who had long grown accustomed to never being heard. While the men around the table murmured among themselves, she stared straight ahead into space, her thin hands resting on her lap. Nora noticed that every so often those frail fingers would begin to move, not with meaningless trembling, but with deliberate effort, trying to say something through awkward gestures that followed no recognizable pattern, part sign language, and part a language she had clearly invented herself, one that only someone truly close to her could have understood. She lifted a hand to touch her throat, then pointed toward the empty glass of water in front of her, a gesture so simple that even a child could have guessed what she meant, yet not a single person at the table bothered to turn toward her. The man seated beside her, younger than Lucian, with a dazzling smile and clever, calculating eyes, whom Nora would later learn was named Marco, glanced at her briefly before waving a waiter over with a careless flick of his hand. He muttered that she wanted another glass of water again, so they should just pour it for her, speaking about her with the same detached tone someone might use for a piece of furniture that needed dusting. Isadora slowly closed her eyes, and in that fleeting moment, Nora saw an entire ocean of anger and heartbreak rising beneath that frozen expression, something only a person who had lived inside silence could ever recognize. Her face couldn't reveal emotion, but her eyes were screaming. She lifted her hand again, this time with greater determination, her fingers tracing a far more complicated shape through the air. Not a single word but an entire sentence, something she desperately wanted to say. Even then, the conversation at the table continued flowing around her, like a river around an unmoving stone. No one stopped, no one looked, no one understood. Her hand continued drawing invisible words through the air, until at last it fell in defeat, dropping heavily back into her lap. Nora stood frozen beside the floral arrangement, still holding the unfinished stems of gardenias, and something tightened painfully inside her chest. The scene was painfully familiar. It was exactly what her father had endured for so many years. It was exactly the way people had always brushed him aside, as though he wasn't worth slowing down for even a single second. Then Marco shattered the silence with a quiet laugh. Leaning toward Lucian, he remarked that the old woman seemed to be getting more confused these days, constantly waving her hands around while no one had the slightest idea what she was trying to say. Then, deliberately speaking louder and more clearly right in front of Isadora, because he knew perfectly well she couldn't hear a single word, he added that Brighthaven had just called to say they finally had an opening. It was an excellent place, with caregivers available around the clock, and perhaps it was finally time for the family to start thinking seriously about sending her there, instead of dragging her everywhere they went. The entire table fell silent for a brief moment. Nora turned toward Lucian, waiting for him to dismiss the suggestion immediately, waiting to see the fury of a son whose mother had just been spoken of that way. But what she saw stunned her even more than Marco's words. Lucian didn't become angry, he simply froze. The fingers that had been absent-mindedly turning the watch on his wrist stopped at once. His jaw tightened for a brief instant. His amber eyes darkened before drifting away, lowering toward the tabletop as though he couldn't bear to look at his own mother. He said nothing at all. He neither agreed nor objected. He simply remained silent, and that silence was so crushingly heavy that it became an answer in itself. Within that silence, Nora read something that perhaps even Lucian himself wasn't willing to admit. He didn't understand his mother either. He too had quietly begun wondering whether she was truly losing her mind. And the most powerful man in the entire city, the man who could make all of Chicago hold its breath, was completely helpless before the woman who had given him life. Once again, a voice echoed inside Nora's mind. It was her own voice from the past 2 years, telling her to stay still, to lower her head, and keep arranging the last few branches of flowers, to remain a shadow, just as she'd always been, because shadows were safe. Shadows were never noticed, and in this room, being noticed could be the most dangerous thing of all. She'd lived by that rule for 2 long years, ever since the day she'd buried her father, and buried with him the language the two of them had once shared. She knew she shouldn't interfere. She shouldn't get involved. She shouldn't let compassion pull her out from behind the wall she'd spent so long building around herself. But then she looked at Isadora again. She looked at those aged hands hanging helplessly in defeat. She saw the way the older woman closed her eyes, as though retreating into some distant place where she wouldn't have to endure the loneliness of being forgotten. And in that single moment, Nora no longer saw Isadora. She saw her father. She saw him sitting quietly at the corner of the family dinner table years ago, while everyone else laughed and chatted about conversations he could never follow. She saw the longing in his eyes as they followed moving lips he desperately wished he could understand. And so, before reason had the chance to stop her, before her survival instinct could silence her once more, Nora set the flower vase down. She stepped out from the safety of her quiet corner, walked past the broad shoulders of dangerous men, and stopped directly in front of Isadora, placing herself between the older woman and everyone else in the room. The elderly woman opened her eyes in surprise, staring blankly at the figure who had suddenly appeared before her. Then Nora slowly raised her hands. They trembled. They were stiff and clumsy after 2 long years of neglect. Her fingers seemed to have forgotten how to move, aching as though she were forcing open a door that had rusted shut long ago. For one terrifying second she feared she'd truly forgotten everything, that the language had died together with her father. But then the old movements returned, slow yet unmistakable. She signed to Isadora. "Hello, my name is Nora. I understand what you're saying." Isadora's eyes widened. The stillness that had frozen across her face seemed to shatter, and in that same instant, behind Nora's back, the silence filling the room changed into something entirely different. It was no longer the silence of men absorbed in business discussions. It became the cold, dangerous silence of predators who'd just discovered an unexpected stranger inside their territory. Nora could feel every pair of eyes drilling into her back. She heard the faint scrape of a chair being pushed away from the table. She heard the quiet sound of someone's hand brushing against the inside of a jacket where something rested that she didn't dare imagine. But she didn't turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on Isadora and continued signing. "What are you trying to tell them? Tell me. I'll speak for you." And Isadora, after a brief moment of stunned disbelief, came alive like someone who'd finally been pulled above the surface after nearly drowning. Her hands suddenly moved with astonishing energy, signing rapidly in the patchwork language she'd created for herself. "You understand? You truly understand? Dear God, how many years has it been?" Nora nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. Then she turned toward Lucian, meeting the amber eyes that were staring straight at her. She spoke aloud, her voice hoarse yet astonishingly steady. "Your mother doesn't want water. She's been trying to tell everyone all evening that she's cold and would like a thicker shawl. She's not confused at all. No one has ever been willing to stop long enough to listen to her." The entire room fell into stunned silence. Marco's mouth dropped open. The man who'd just started to stand froze halfway out of his chair. And Lucian Vitale, for the first time that entire evening, truly looked at Nora. Not the casual glance given to a shadow, not the dismissive look reserved for an inconvenient object, but the focused, penetrating stare of a man desperately searching for deception, manipulation, or some hidden motive. Yet all he found was an utterly exhausted young woman whose hands were still trembling and whose stubborn eyes refused to look away, and somehow, for reasons he couldn't explain, That unsettled him far more than any threat ever could. Nora couldn't remember how she'd left that room. She only knew that her feet had carried her out on their own, that she'd pushed the heavy oak door shut behind her, and that the suffocating noise of room 7 had been cut off as abruptly as if someone had flipped a switch, giving way to the cool silence of the hallway behind the restaurant, where nothing remained but the lingering smell of cold grease and floor cleaner. She managed only a few steps before leaning against the brick wall. The strength that had carried her through the entire evening suddenly abandoned her. She slowly slid down until she was sitting on the cold tile floor, drawing her knees close and burying her face against them. Only then did the trembling truly begin. It wasn't the trembling born of fear of the guns hidden beneath tailored jackets, or the murderous stares that had followed her from the room. It came from something far deeper than that, something she'd locked away inside her heart for the past 2 years, and had only moments ago torn open with her own hands. Her hands still ached, her fingers throbbed with a dull pain, as though they'd just awakened from a long winter sleep. She stared at them beneath the dim yellow lights of the hallway. Those hands had betrayed her. Those hands had found their voice again, in the very language she'd sworn to bury forever. Fool, she thought bitterly, pressing her palms tightly over her eyes until bursts of light danced in the darkness. You're such a fool. What have you done? You just walked straight into a room filled with people who could make you disappear from this world without anyone ever knowing, all because you did the one thing you swore you'd never do again. Yet even as she scolded herself, she couldn't stop the memories from flooding back, because the movement of her hands only moments before had forced open a door she'd kept sealed inside her mind. Once again she saw herself as a little girl of perhaps 5 or 6 years old, standing inside her father's old violin workshop, surrounded by the scent of fresh wood shavings and glue, looking up at the tall man with weathered hands as he knelt until they were eye level. Her father, Desmond Vance, couldn't hear his daughter's voice, but he'd taught her the very first language of her life, not with spoken words, but with his hands. She remembered perfectly the very first sign he'd ever shown her. He'd gently touched his hand to his own chest, and then pointed toward her. Such a simple gesture, yet it took her many years to fully understand its meaning. I love you. She'd imitated him with her own tiny, awkward hands, touching her chest before pointing back at him, and Desmond's face had lit up with a smile so radiant that even now, curled up on the cold tile floor of this dark hallway, Nora could still see it with perfect clarity. That was the moment she'd learned that love didn't need sound, that a pair of hands could speak truths that 1,000 spoken words could never fully express. And that was why refusing to sign during the past 2 years had never simply meant forgetting a language. It had meant severing the final thread that still connected her to her late father. It had meant quietly letting him die inside her heart all over again, day after day. She quickly brushed away the tears that had escaped the corners of her eyes, drew a long, steady breath, and told herself that tonight had been nothing more than a single mistake. She'd never allow it to happen again. She'd become that invisible shadow once more, just as she'd been before. Yet even as she tried to believe those words, somewhere deep inside, she already understood that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. Nora didn't know how long she'd sat there on the cold tile, but the work wasn't finished, and her flower arrangement was still inside that room, so eventually, she forced herself up, smoothed the front of her dress, drew a steadying breath, and pushed back through the heavy oak doors, as though nothing had happened. The atmosphere inside had shifted. The men were rising now, buttoning their jackets, the low murmur of business winding down into the shuffle of departure, and for the first time all evening, the crushing isolation that had wrapped itself around Isadora was gone. The old woman sat straighter in her chair, a faint color in her cheeks, and when she caught sight of Nora returning, her eyes lit up with a warmth that made something ache behind Nora's ribs. Nora went quietly to the side table, gathered the wilted stems she'd left behind, and tried to make herself invisible again, but she could feel it now, the weight of a gaze that no longer looked through her but at her, and when she finally glanced up, she found Lucian Vitali watching her with that same searching, unhurried intensity, as if she were a puzzle he hadn't decided whether to solve or discard. He crossed the room toward her without hurry, and every man still lingering seemed to fall silent at once, giving him a wide and instinctive berth. He stopped an arm's length away, reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, and for one dizzying second, Nora's heart slammed against her chest, and she braced for something terrible. But what he drew out was only a slim fold of bills, and he peeled off 5 crisp $100 notes and held them out to her between 2 long fingers. "The bill's already been paid," she said, her voice tighter than she meant it to be. "Your associate settled it earlier." "This isn't for the bill," Lucian answered, and his voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that never needed to rise to be obeyed. "It's for the translation." Nora looked down at the money hovering in the space between them, and God knew she needed it. $500 was more than she made in 2 exhausting weeks. It was the electric bill that had a shut-off notice taped to her door. It was groceries that weren't just bread and canned soup. It was breathing room she hadn't felt in months, and yet she didn't reach for it. She lifted her eyes back to his instead, and something reckless and honest rose in her that she couldn't quite swallow down. "I didn't do it for money," she said. Lucian's expression didn't change, but the hand holding the money went still. "Then why?" he asked. And it wasn't a challenge. It was something closer to genuine bewilderment, as though in his world every act came with a price tag, and a woman refusing cash was a thing he simply couldn't parse. "Because sitting in silence while the whole world talks around you," Nora said quietly, "is a terrible way to live. I watched someone I loved live that way for a long time, and I couldn't watch it happen to someone else and just pour the water and walk out." She hadn't meant to say so much, and the moment the words left her she felt exposed, raw, as if she'd handed this dangerous stranger a key to a room she kept locked even from herself. For a long moment, Lucian said nothing. He simply looked at her, and behind him, Isadora was watching too, her sharp old eyes moving between the two of them with an expression Nora couldn't read. Then, slowly, Lucian lowered his hand. He didn't put the money away. Instead, he stepped past her to the small hostess stand by the door and set the 5 bills down on its polished surface, deliberately, as if to say the offer would remain whether she took it or not. Nora expected him to leave then, to sweep out into the night with his men and his mother, and forget her by morning. But at the threshold he paused, one hand on the doorframe, and turned his head just enough to catch her in the corner of his amber gaze. "See you Thursday, Nora," he said. It wasn't a question. He hadn't asked whether she'd be working, hadn't asked whether she wanted to see him or his mother again, hadn't left any room at all for her to answer. He stated it the way a man states a fact that has already been decided, a thing carved into the shape of the future, before she'd even been consulted, and then he offered his arm to Isadora, who took it while glancing back at Nora with a small, satisfied smile, and the two of them walked out into the falling snow. Nora stood alone in the doorway, staring at the $500 on the stand, and though she couldn't have said why, a cold thread of certainty wound its way down her spine, the quiet and terrible understanding that her invisible little life had just ended. The following Thursday, Nora told herself a dozen times that she wouldn't do anything foolish, that she would set down her flowers and slip out like the shadow she was meant to be, and yet her hands betrayed that resolve before she'd even reached the restaurant, because when she'd assembled the arrangement that afternoon, she had reached past the roses and the lilies and chosen gardenias, the way she always did when her heart was heavy without quite understanding why. She carried the white blooms into room number 7, where the Vitali family had already gathered, fewer of them tonight, just Lucian and Isadora, and the younger man Marco, and 2 guards stationed silently by the wall, and the moment she uncovered the flowers their heavy sweetness bloomed outward and filled the whole room, that thick honeyed perfume that seemed almost too much for a single small bouquet to hold. She set the vase on the side table, and began her quiet work, and she did not notice at first that something had changed in the old woman across the room, did not notice until she heard the scrape of a chair against the floor, and looked up to find Isadora rising unsteadily to her feet. Every head in the room turned. Marco half stood as if to stop her, and one of the guards shifted forward, but Lucian raised a single hand, and they all went still, and in the sudden hush, Isadora crossed the room, with slow, deliberate steps, until she reached the side table where the gardenias stood. She did not touch them at first. She simply closed her eyes and leaned in, and pressed her lined face gently against the cluster of white petals, and breathed, and something in the way her shoulders dropped, in the way the perpetual tension around her jaw finally loosened, made the whole room fall silent in a different register entirely, because they were watching a woman come back to life. Lucian stared at his mother as though he were seeing a ghost. Nora would learn later that it had been years since Isadora had stood on her own without being told to, years since she had done anything unprompted at all, and here she was, crossing a room of her own free will to bury her face in a handful of flowers, and none of them understood why except Nora, who stood frozen with a stem still in her hand, and felt her throat tighten with a recognition that came from somewhere deep and old inside her. Because the scent of gardenias was not just a scent to Nora either. It carried her instantly and helplessly back to her father's workshop, to the low, crowded room that smelled of cedar shavings and varnish and glue, where amid the half-finished violins and the coils of wire, there had sat on the windowsill a single potted gardenia that Desmond Vance had tended with a care that seemed almost out of place in those large, calloused hands. She remembered how he could not hear the radio, could not hear birdsong or rain or the voices of the neighbors, and how he had once told her, his hands moving slowly in the light from that window, that the flower was his music, that when it bloomed the whole room filled up with something he could feel even if he could not hear it, a richness in the air that reached him where sound never could. She had been too young then to understand what he meant, had thought it only a strange fancy of his, but standing here now watching Isadora press her face into the white petals with her eyes shut, and her whole body softening, Nora finally understood it completely, that for those locked away inside silence, the world could still speak, just in other languages, through scent and touch and the tremble of the floor, and that a single flower could say what 1,000 unheard voices could not. She felt her eyes sting and blinked hard, and when she looked up she found Lucian had turned from his mother to her, and his amber gaze held a question so raw and unguarded that it startled her, the look of a man watching a locked door open in front of him, and realizing for the first time that it had a key, and that the key had been in the room all along. He did not speak. He only looked from his mother to the flowers, to Nora and back again, his jaw working, his hand curled tight around the old watch on his wrist, and Nora understood that whatever fragile, bewildered thing had begun to stir in him that first night had just deepened into something he could no longer pretend not to see. When the meal wound down, and the men drifted toward the far end of the room to murmur over their glasses, Isadora caught Nora's wrist as she passed with a stack of cleared plates, and drew her gently down into the empty chair beside her, and Nora, glancing once toward Lucian who only watched without objection, set the plates aside, and let herself be pulled into the old woman's orbit. Isadora's hands began to move at once, quick and eager despite the stiffness of her arthritic fingers, and Nora leaned in close to read the chopped and improvised language that was half proper sign and half a private vocabulary the old woman had cobbled together over the years, the kind of thing no stranger could ever hope to follow, but that Nora's eye, trained since childhood on her father's own invented shorthand, could piece together with surprising ease. "You think you found me by accident," Isadora signed, a sly light in her dark eyes. "But you are wrong, child." Nora frowned, not understanding, and asked her what she meant. The old woman's mouth curved into something that was almost mischief. "That first night," she went on, her hands slowing so Nora could catch every word, "I saw you by the flowers. I saw your hands. You made a sign without meaning to, and then you stopped yourself. You froze like a thief caught in a light, and you thought no one noticed. But I notice everything now," she added, tapping one finger beside her eye. "When you take away a person's ears, the eyes learn to do the work of two. I have spent years watching the mouths of people who never once looked back at me. So I saw your hands, and I knew. I knew you understood." Nora felt the breath catch in her chest, because she had believed that moment private, believed her lapse had gone unseen by all but her own shame, and to learn that the old woman had witnessed it and understood its meaning turned the whole memory inside out. Then why? Nora signed, her fingers unsteady. Why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you try to get my attention? Isadora let out a soft breath through her nose, the ghost of a laugh. Because I have learned patience, she answered. If I had reached for you, waved my arms, made a scene, they would have called it another one of the old woman's fits. Marco would have had one more story to tell about how confused I have become. She glanced toward the far end of the room where Marco stood laughing at something, and her expression hardened for just a moment before it softened again. No, she sighed. I did not chase you. I waited. Every Thursday I sat in this chair, and I watched you come and go with your flowers, and I let them think I was empty, and I waited for you to be ready. Because I could see it in the way you held yourself that you were carrying something heavy, that the language was not lost to you but buried. And buried things must be dug up by the one who buried them or not at all. I have waited many weeks for you, child. And then last week you finally came to me. Nora sat very still, the words settling over her like snowfall, and she realized with a slow overturning sense of wonder that she had gotten the entire story backward, that she had walked into this room believing herself the rescuer who had stumbled upon a helpless woman drowning in silence, when the truth was that Isadora had been no drowning victim at all, but a patient and deliberate presence who had spotted a kindred wound across a crowded room and chosen, with the quiet cunning of someone who had spent decades learning to survive being underestimated, to wait for that wound to come to her. It was not Nora who had found Isadora, it was Isadora who had found Nora, and who had reeled her in with nothing but stillness and time. The old woman reached out and patted her cheek, papery fingers cool against Nora's skin. You did not save me, she sighed, her eyes crinkling. We are saving each other. And Nora, for the first time in 2 years, felt something in the frozen ground of her grief crack open and let in a thin and unexpected shaft of light. The Thursdays that followed settled into a strange new rhythm, and though Nora kept telling herself she was still only the girl who arranged the flowers, the truth was that she had become something else entirely. A bridge, an interpreter, a thread that ran between a mother and a son who had forgotten how to reach one another. Lucian began to make use of her almost at once, and at first Nora was too surprised by the sheer fact of his attention to notice what was wrong with the way he did it. Tell her the driver will come at 10 tomorrow, he would say, not looking at his mother but at Nora, and Nora would turn and relay it, and Isadora would nod. Tell her the contractor is coming Tuesday to fix the roof of the sunroom, he would say, his eyes on Nora the entire time, and Nora would translate, and so it went, message after message, each one delivered to her as though she were a machine that took words in one end and produced them out the other. He never once turned his face toward Isadora when he spoke. He never once let his own hands try to shape even the clumsiest sign. He simply spoke into the air in Nora's direction and waited for the meaning to arrive on the other side, as if his mother were not a person seated an arm's length away, but a distant office he was contacting through a switchboard. And the longer it went on, the more something hot and prickling gathered at the back of Nora's neck. She had seen this before. She had lived this before. She remembered standing in banks and doctors' offices and school hallways as a girl while adults spoke to her instead of to her father, asking her what he wanted, what he needed, whether he understood. Always her, never him, as though a man who could not hear had also somehow ceased to be a man who could think or feel or be addressed directly, and she remembered the particular rage that used to rise in her small chest at the casual cruelty of it, a cruelty that was almost worse for being unthinking. And now here it was again, dressed in a fine charcoal suit, and something in her simply would not let it pass a second time. It happened over something small. Lucian had just told her to inform Isadora that a cousin was coming to visit from out of state the following month, and Nora set down the water pitcher she'd been holding and did not turn to translate. Instead, she looked at him, and the words came out before her sense of self-preservation could clamp down on them. Tell her yourself, she said. The low murmur at the table died. Lucian went still, and his amber eyes lifted to hers with a slow, dangerous curiosity. I don't speak sign, he said, and there was a warning in the quiet of it. Then learn, Nora answered. And though her knees had gone watery, she did not look away. It's not a secret code, it's a language, and she's sitting right there beside you, close enough to touch. You've been talking to her through me for weeks, as if she's somewhere else, as if she's already gone, and she isn't. She's right here. Stop making me the wall between you. The silence that followed stretched so taut that Nora could hear her own pulse in her ears, and Marco, at the far end of the table, made a small choked sound and quickly buried it in his glass. She waited for the fury, for the cold command that would have her thrown out into the snow, because she had just spoken to Lucian Vitali the way no one in this city dared to, but the fury never came. Lucian leaned slowly back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't name, taking in the stubborn set of her jaw, and the tremor she couldn't quite hide in her hands, and the way she forced herself to hold his gaze anyway. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge, and turned into something quieter, something almost uncertain, a tone she suspected very few people had ever heard from him. "Show me," he said. Nora blinked, thrown. "What?" "Show me how to say it," he said, and he shifted in his chair, and for the first time all evening he turned his body fully toward his mother. "Show me how to tell her about the cousin." But that lesson would come later, because before Nora could begin to break the sentence down for him, the evening took a turn that would stay with her long after, and it began with Isadora growing restless in her chair. It was a small thing at first, the old woman shifting her weight, her fingers plucking at the wine-colored shawl across her shoulders, her eyes moving around the room with a searching quality Nora had not seen in them before, and Nora set down what she was doing, and knelt beside her, and asked what was wrong, what did she need, and Isadora's hands lifted at once and began to move, urgent and insistent, shaping something in the air. Nora watched, and for the first time since that opening night, a cold flush of panic crept over her, because she could not understand. The signs came quickly, and they were not the ordinary ones. Not water, or cold, or tired, or any of the simple needs Nora had grown fluent in reading, but something more particular. A sequence of gestures the old woman repeated again and again with mounting frustration, her fingers curving into a shape that might have been a flower, or might have been a cupped hand, then sweeping outward, then pressing to her own chest above the heart, and Nora leaned closer and closer, and shook her head and signed, "I don't understand. Show me again." Slower, and Isadora showed her again, slower, and still it would not come clear. It was the private half of her language, the improvised part, the shorthand grown out of decades of a single person's silence. And where Nora's childhood with her father had given her the key to so much of it, this particular thing lay outside her reach, a word in a dialect she had never learned. Isadora's face could not show her distress, held rigid as it was, but her eyes filled with a shining desperation, and her hands began to tremble harder, and she signed it a fourth time and a fifth, and each time Nora had to answer with the same helpless shake of her head, and she watched something terrible happen in the old woman, watched the brief light that had been kindled over these past weeks begin to gutter, watched Isadora slowly lower her hands into her lap and turn her face away toward the wall with an expression of such quiet defeat that it struck Nora like a blow. Marco, from across the table, gave a short laugh and remarked that, see, this was exactly what he meant. The old woman was getting harder to manage by the week, but for once Nora barely heard him, because all her attention was fixed on Isadora, and on the awful realization sinking through her that she had failed, that the one thing she had promised this woman without ever speaking it aloud, the promise to be the one person who would always understand, she had just broken. She reached out and touched Isadora's hand, gently, and signed, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I will figure it out. I promise you I will figure it out." But the old woman only patted her fingers absently, the way one comforts a child for a disappointment too complicated to explain, and would not meet her eyes again for the rest of the meal. Lucian had watched the whole exchange in silence, and though he could not have understood a single sign that passed between them, he had read the outcome plainly enough in the slump of his mother's shoulders, and the stricken look on Nora's face. And when Nora finally rose on unsteady legs to gather the last of the plates, He stopped her with a low, quiet question, asking what it was she had wanted. "I don't know," Nora admitted, and the words cost her something to say. She wanted something that matters to her very much, and I couldn't understand it. I couldn't give it to her. And as she carried the plates out of that room, she carried the failure with her too, heavier than any tray, because she knew what it was to spend a life reaching out for something, and having no one able to catch hold of the other end. And she swore to herself in that dim hallway that whatever the old woman had been asking for, she would not rest until she had found it. It was Lucian who asked her to stay behind after the others had gone, the following Thursday, and Nora who agreed only because his mother had gripped her sleeve and signed "please" with a look that left no room for refusal. And so when the room had emptied of guards and of Marco, and of everyone but the three of them, Lucian pulled a chair around to face his mother the way Nora had told him to weeks before, and said, without quite meeting Nora's eyes, "Teach me." She had expected him to be impatient, to demand mastery the way she imagined he demanded everything, but what she had not expected was how badly he would struggle, and how much that struggle would cost a man who was so plainly unaccustomed to being bad at anything. She started him small, with a single word, the word for cousin, since that was what he had wanted to tell his mother that first time, and she showed him how to bring his hand up beside his head and shake it lightly, a simple motion, the kind a child could learn in a minute. And Lucian raised his own hand and tried to copy it, and got it wrong. His fingers, long and scarred across the knuckles and clearly capable of a great many things, refused entirely to bend the way the sign required, coming out rigid and blunt where they needed to be loose. And he tried again, and got it wrong again, and Nora gently reached out and touched his hand to adjust it, feeling him go very still at the contact before she withdrew, and he tried a third time and it was still wrong. She watched something flicker across his face that she had never seen there before, a flash of pure frustration quickly buried, and she understood that this was a man who controlled shipping routes and city councilmen and the fates of people who crossed him, and here he was defeated by the geometry of his own fingers. "Again," she said, softening her voice. "Watch me. Don't force it. Let your hand be loose." And he tried again and again, the same small motion over and over, and each time his hand betrayed him, until at last something in him snapped, and he brought his fist down against the tabletop hard enough to rattle the wine glasses, a low, vicious sound escaping him, and for a moment the old dangerous stillness returned to the room, and Nora's breath caught. But Isadora did not flinch. The old woman had been watching her son's struggle with an intensity that matched his own, her dark eyes fixed on his hands, with something Nora could only describe as hunger, the hunger of a mother who has waited years to see her child reach toward her, and now she leaned forward and did something that undid Nora completely. She took Lucian's large, clumsy hand in both of her small, trembling ones, and she did not correct it or reshape it. She simply held it, looked into his face, and waited. The fight went out of him all at once. His shoulders dropped, the tension bled from his jaw, and he let his mother hold his hand, and then slowly, breathing out, he tried the sign one more time with her hands cradling his, guiding, without forcing, and this time it came, imperfect and stiff and nothing like graceful but unmistakable, the sign for cousin, formed at last by a hand that had never in its life shaped a tender thing. Isadora's breath hitched. Her face could not smile the way another face would have, but her whole body seemed to lean toward him, and she pressed his newly obedient hand against her cheek, and held it there, and Nora saw the old woman's eyes brim over, saw a single tear track down into the deep lines of her face, and had to look away toward the window to keep her own composure. When she looked back, Lucian was staring at his own hand, as though it belonged to a stranger, turning it over slowly in the lamplight, and there was an expression on his face that she suspected no one in his world had ever been permitted to see, a kind of stunned and fragile wonder, the look of a man who had just discovered that a single word, formed with his own flawed fingers, could reach a place that all his money and all his power never had. He did not thank her. He did not say anything at all, but something between them had shifted. Some wall she had felt looming since that very first night had developed a hairline crack running straight through it, and both of them knew that once a wall begins to crack it can never quite be made whole again. The failure had not left Nora, and in the days between, she turned the memory of Isadora's gestures over and over in her mind, like a locksmith working a stubborn lock, that curving of the fingers into something like a bloom, that sweep outward, that press to the heart, and slowly a suspicion took shape in her, born of the way the old woman had crossed a room to bury her face in gardenias, born of something her father had once told her about how the deaf hold on to the world through what they can still reach. It was a flower. It had to be a flower, but not just any flower, a particular one, something specific enough that the ordinary sign would not do, and so Nora began to search. She spent an afternoon she could not afford at the city's oldest florist, describing the gesture to a bewildered old man behind the counter, and then an evening bent over library books of botanical prints, watching for any bloom that might match the shape those trembling hands had drawn, and at last, in a slim volume about the flowers of the Mediterranean, she found it, a spray of small white blossoms with a name she had to say aloud twice before she believed it. Orange blossom, Zagara, the flower Italian audiences had once thrown onto opera stages in great drifts for the singers they loved. Something clicked into place in Nora's mind, and she remembered a thing she had overheard once. A fragment of a story about the old woman's past that she had not understood at the time, and she knew she had found it. It took her the better part of a week and nearly the last of her savings to track down the blossoms out of season, calling greenhouses and specialty growers, until a small shop 3 train transfers away agreed to set aside a single fragrant sprig, and she carried it to the restaurant the next Thursday wrapped in damp paper against her chest, like something alive. When she unwrapped it in room number 7, and its sharp, sweet perfume lifted into the air, entirely different from the heavy gardenia she usually brought, Isadora turned toward it the way a plant turns toward the sun. The old woman went utterly still. Then her hands came up to her mouth, and her eyes flooded, and she began to weep, silently, the way she did everything now, her shoulders shaking with sobs that made no sound at all, and Nora knelt beside her, and took her hand, and asked softly what it was. What did this flower mean? Tell me. And Isadora, weeping, began to sign. She told her, in that broken private language that Nora could suddenly follow now that she knew where it was pointing, about a night nearly 30 years ago, the last night she had ever sung, a performance of an opera about a woman who waits and waits for a love that will not come, and how at the end of it the audience had risen, and the air had filled with these very blossoms raining down onto the stage around her feet, and how she had stood in that storm of white flowers, breathing in their scent, not knowing, not having any way to know, that it would be the last sound she would ever hear. The roar of that applause, because within weeks, an illness would take her hearing entirely and forever, and she would never stand on a stage again. Lucian sat frozen at the head of the table, and Nora, her own eyes wet, translated it all aloud for him in a low voice, and she watched the man absorb something about his mother he had plainly never known, watched him understand for the first time that the silent, rigid old woman he had been carting from house to restaurant like a piece of inconvenient furniture had once been a person whose voice could fill a great hall and bring strangers to their feet, a person with a whole radiant life that had existed long before she was his mother and that had been stolen from her in a matter of weeks. He looked at Isadora as though seeing her whole for the very first time, and when she finally lifted her wet face and reached out to touch the white blossoms with one trembling finger, he did not look away, and Nora understood that she had done more than solve a puzzle. She had handed this broken family back a piece of the woman at its center that all of them, including the woman herself, had very nearly let disappear. What happened next, Nora would remember for the rest of her life, because it was not a thing she taught him, and not a thing anyone could have taught him. It was something Lucian arrived at entirely on his own. He set down his glass, and he rose from the head of the table, and he came around to where his mother sat weeping over the white blossoms, and he lowered himself into the chair beside her, and then he did the one thing Nora had never once in her life managed to give the person she had loved most. He simply waited. He turned his whole body toward Isadora, and he looked into her face, and he did not reach for his phone, did not glance toward the door, did not fill the silence with words she could not hear, or with instructions relayed through Noor. He only sat, still and patient, and he waited for his mother to gather herself and speak. And Isadora, when she understood what he was doing, when she understood that for the first time her son was not trying to move her along, or hush her, or manage her, but was actually and only waiting to hear whatever she had to say, began slowly to sign, and her hands were stiff and her thoughts came haltingly, and it took her a long time. Nearly 2 full minutes of unbroken quiet, in a room where such a man was accustomed to being obeyed in seconds. And through all of it, Lucian did not move, did not rush her, did not once look away. And Nora stood off to the side with her hand pressed over her mouth, because she could not bear how much it undid her. For she was not only watching Lucian and his mother, she was watching, laid over them like a double exposure, a scene from 9 years ago that she had spent 2 years trying not to see, herself at 19, exhausted and resentful, and desperate to be a normal girl with a normal life, standing in the kitchen of the little house above the workshop, while her father tried to tell her something with his hands, and she remembered how she had not waited, how she had been in a hurry to leave, how his signs had come slow and searching the way Isadora's did now, and how she had cut him off, and worse than cut him off, she remembered what she had signed at him in that terrible, careless moment, the cruelest thing her hands had ever said, that she wished she did not have to be his ears for the rest of her life, that she was tired of translating a world that did not want to slow down for either of them. She remembered the way his face had changed, the way something had gone quiet and wounded behind his eyes, and she remembered slamming out of the house, and she remembered that she had never gotten the chance to take it back, because he was gone within the month, gone suddenly while she was away chasing the ordinary life she had wanted so badly, and the last words her hands had ever spoken to her father had been words meant to hurt him. She had never forgiven herself. She had put her hands away so she would not have to remember, and now she stood in a gilded private room, watching a hardened and dangerous man do for his mother the simple, merciful thing she had refused her own father, giving the gift of his patience, his stillness, his willingness to wait however long it took, and it broke something loose in her chest that she had been holding clenched for 2 years. When Isadora at last finished signing, whatever it was she had needed so badly to say, Lucian did not know the words, and he did not ask Nora to translate them. He only took his mother's trembling hands in both of his and pressed them gently, and Isadora lifted one of those hands to his cheek and held it there, and the man who ran half the city closed his eyes and let his mother hold his face. And in the doorway Nora wept quietly for a father she could no longer say she was sorry to, and understood that she had wandered into this dark family carrying a wound that was the exact shape of the one she was helping to heal. But not everyone in that family was moved by what had begun to grow in room number 7, and Marco had been watching it with a mounting unease that Nora mistook at first for mere jealousy, before she understood how much more calculated it was. She learned the shape of it one Thursday, when she arrived early, and heard raised voices through the doors, or rather, one raised voice, Marco's, and she lingered in the hall long enough to catch the thread of it, that he was pressing Lucian about the old woman, about how her condition made her a liability, about papers and signatures and something called a conservatorship, about how it would be cleaner and safer for the family's holdings if control of Isadora's share, and it seemed she held no small share, were formally placed in steadier hands, meaning of course his own. He had documents, Nora realized. He had come with documents already drawn up by some cooperative lawyer, papers that declared Isadora mentally incapacitated, no longer competent to manage her own affairs, or make her own decisions, and all that was needed was for a physician to sign, and for the family not to contest it, and Marco had spent months laying the groundwork. Every casual remark about Brighthaven and the old woman's confusion, a small stone set carefully into place, to build exactly this. When Nora came into the room, Marco fell silent and smiled at her, but it was a cold smile, and she understood that she had become an obstacle to him, the one person whose very existence disproved the story he had been so patiently telling, that Isadora was empty, gone, incapable. Because how could a woman be incompetent when she sat here every week having whole conversations, cracking dry jokes, weeping over the memory of a performance 30 years past. If only someone bothered to speak her language. That evening, Marco made his move openly, sliding the papers across the white tablecloth toward Lucian, and speaking in a reasonable, regretful tone about doing what was best for her. And Nora watched Lucian's face close over, watched the terrible pull in him between the brother he had grown up trusting and the mother he was only now learning to reach. And she saw that he was wavering, that the old poison of doubt Marco had been dripping in his ear for months had done its work, and so Nora did the only thing she could think to do. She crossed to Isadora and knelt and signed rapidly, explaining what the papers were, what Marco was trying to do, that he wanted to declare her unfit and take away her right to decide anything for herself ever again. She watched the comprehension dawn in the old woman's sharp eyes, and then she watched something magnificent happen, watched Isadora's spine straighten, and her chin lift, and the old singer who had once commanded great halls drew herself up in her chair and held out one trembling hand for a pen. Nora gave her one, and Isadora, with the whole room watching, took the papers Marco had prepared and turned them over to their blank reverse, and wrote in a shaking but perfectly legible hand a few short lines, and pushed them back across the table, and gestured for Nora to read them aloud. Nora's voice was steady as she read what the old woman had written, that she, Isadora Vitale, was of entirely sound mind, that she understood precisely what her nephew was attempting, and precisely why, that she was deaf and not dead, and certainly not stupid, and that she named her own son as the only person she trusted with her affairs, and would put that in writing before any lawyer Marco cared to summon. The signature at the bottom was firm. Marco's face drained of color. He began to sputter something about how this proved nothing, how anyone could coach her, but Lucian had gone very quiet and very still, looking down at his mother's handwriting, at the sharp, clear proof of the mind everyone had agreed to pretend was gone, and when he lifted his eyes to Marco there was something in them that made the younger man stop talking mid-sentence. "Take your papers," Lucian said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "and get out of my sight, and we will speak later about how long you have been planning this." Marco gathered the documents with shaking hands and left, and Nora, kneeling still beside Isadora, felt the old woman's fingers close around hers in a grip that was anything but frail, and understood that she had just made an enemy, and that in this world enemies did not simply fade away. The Thursday it happened had been the gentlest evening yet, and that was the cruelty of it, that the danger came precisely when Nora had finally let herself forget it existed. It was only the three of them and a single guard beyond the doors, and Isadora had brought a tablet with photographs of her garden and was showing them to Nora one by one, complaining in cheerful rapid signs about the aphids devouring her roses and the gardener who did not listen, and Nora was laughing, really laughing, a warm and unguarded sound that felt almost foreign in that heavy paneled room, and even Lucian had set aside whatever hardness he carried and was watching the two of them with something that on another man's face might have been called contentment. Then the ordinary murmur of the restaurant beyond the doors changed. It was not loud at first, just a single heavy sound, a dull thud somewhere out in the main dining room, followed a heartbeat later by a woman's thin rising cry, and Lucian was on his feet before Nora's mind had even finished registering the noise, moving with a speed that turned him into someone else entirely, his chair toppling behind him, and there was suddenly a dark weight in his hand that had not been there a moment ago. "Down," he said. One sharp word, and Nora's body obeyed on instinct born not of any experience with this world, but of a childhood in a hard neighborhood where you learned young to drop at certain sounds, and she went to the floor at once. But Isadora did not. The old woman remained upright in her high-backed chair, her eyes still on the tablet in her lap, entirely and terribly unaware, because she had not heard the thud, or the scream, or her son's shouted command, could not hear the heavy running footsteps now approaching the private room, lived in a pocket of perfect silence, while the world outside it came apart, and in that instant, Nora understood the full horror of what it meant to be locked inside that quiet, that danger could be bearing down upon you from every side, and your own body would not so much as flinch, because no one had found a way to tell you to be afraid. The doors burst inward. A figure Nora did not recognize filled the doorway, and there was something raised in his hands. And Lucian was fast, but he was on the wrong side of the long table, too far, and Nora saw all of it in a single suspended fragment of time, and laced through it, sharp as a blade, came the memory that had haunted her for 2 years. Her father stepping off a curb he could not hear the danger of, the screech and the horror of what she had not been there to prevent. And that memory seized her body and moved it before her thoughts could catch up. She did not think. She launched herself up from her crouch and threw the whole of her weight against Isadora's chair, wrapping her arms around the old woman's frail frame and dragging them both down and sideways to the floor behind the heavy table, just as the room split open, with a sound that punched the air from her chest, and she felt splinters of wood rain down across her back, and smelled something sharp and acrid and chemical bloom through the sweetness of the flowers. Then, almost at once, an answering series of sounds from Lucian's side of the room, and a heavy silence, and then the diminishing noise of chaos moving away, of patrons fleeing, of the danger, whatever it had been, undone. Nora lay pressed flat over Isadora's small body on the floor, her ears filled with a high, thin ringing, her heart slamming, her arms still locked around the old woman as though she could shield her from the entire world through sheer force of will. Beneath her, Isadora was rigid with a fear that had arrived far too late to do her any good, having felt the impact through the floorboards, and smelled the sharpness in the air, and finally understood that something had gone terribly wrong, and she clutched at Nora's sleeve with both hands, her whole body trembling. "It is all right," Nora signed against her, pulling back just far enough to shape the words where the old woman could see them, over and over. "It is over. You are safe. I have you. It is over." And then hands were on her, and she twisted in alarm before she recognized the touch, and it was Lucian, on his knees beside them, and his face when she saw it was nothing like the cold flat mask she had first met. It was cracked wide open with a raw and naked terror, and his hands were moving frantically over his mother first, checking her, and then over Nora, and they were shaking. The hands of the most dangerous man in the city were shaking, and Nora realized that in the space of 30 seconds, everything between the three of them had changed forever. The ringing in Nora's ears drowned out everything else, a high, thin whine where the world's sound should have been, and for a few seconds, she lay pressed against the floor with her arms still wrapped around the old woman's trembling frame, not daring to move, breathing in dust and the sharp, acrid smell of what had just happened. Then hands were on her, and she flinched before she understood they were not rough, that the grip on her shoulder was frantic rather than cruel, and she opened her eyes to find Lucian on his knees beside them amid the overturned chairs and the scattered white petals, his weapon already set aside on the floor, his chest heaving. The cold, flat distance was gone from his amber eyes entirely, burned away, and in its place was a raw and naked panic she would not have believed him capable of, and he did not check himself first, did not look to the door, or to whatever lay beyond it. He reached for his mother, running his hands over her shoulders and her arms and her face, searching for any hurt, and Isadora, pale and shaking but whole, caught his hands and signed with unsteady fingers that she was all right. She was not hurt. She was fine. Lucian let out a ragged breath and pressed his forehead to his mother's shoulder for the space of a single heartbeat, and then he turned to Nora. She had pushed herself up to sit against the base of the table, and there was a thin line of blood tracking down her cheek where a splinter of wood had caught her, and her dress was gray with dust, and she was trembling so hard she could not have stood if she tried. Lucian moved toward her on his knees and lifted one hand, and with a gentleness that seemed impossible in fingers that had a moment ago been wrapped around a weapon, he wiped the blood from her jaw with the side of his thumb, and Nora saw that his hand was shaking too. "You covered her," he said, and his voice was stripped of all its usual authority, hoarse and low and almost disbelieving. "She couldn't have known," Nora whispered, her own throat raw. She couldn't hear it. She didn't know to get down. Someone had to move her. He stared at her then, and something in the way he looked at her had changed irrevocably, because she was not a waitress to him anymore, and not a convenient interpreter, And not even the girl who had cracked open the wall between him and his mother. She was the woman who had thrown her own body between Isadora and harm without a half-second's hesitation, who had not run when everyone with any sense would have run, and he looked at her as though he were rearranging his entire understanding of what she was. "You're bleeding," he said softly. "It's nothing," Nora tried to say, tried to pull back from the intensity of it, suddenly frightened of the heat in his gaze, more than she had been frightened of anything else that night. But his hand slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers threading into the loosened hair at her nape, and he held her there, not hard, just anchoring her, his thumb resting against the frantic beat of her pulse. "Nobody touches my family," he said, and his voice dropped into something so quiet and so absolute that it seemed to still the very air in the ruined room, a vow more than a statement. And then his eyes moved over her face, over the blood, and the dust, and the stubborn, frightened set of her mouth, and he said the rest of it in the same low, unbreakable tone. "And nobody touches you. Not anymore." Nora's breath caught in her chest. She looked into those amber eyes and understood, with a slow, cold clarity that had nothing to do with the fading ring in her ears, the terrible truth of what had just happened, that she had not only saved an old woman's life tonight, she had, without ever meaning to, written herself permanently into the foundation of this man's world, and that a man like Lucian Vitali did not loosen his grip on the things he had decided were his. Nora woke to a silence unlike any she had ever known, not the thin, noisy quiet of her old studio with its clanking radiator and the buses groaning past below the window, but a deep upholstered hush, the silence of triple-glazed glass and thick walls, and a great deal of money, and she lay for a long moment in a bed so soft it felt almost accusatory, before the events of the night before came rushing back, and she sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. She was in an enormous room she had never seen, pale light spilling across a floor of dark polished wood, and on a velvet chair in the corner sat her own shabby canvas tote bag, looking small and out of place, and beside it, folded neatly, a stack of clothing that was clearly new and clearly expensive and, when she rose to examine it, clearly and unsettlingly, exactly her size. She learned the rest in pieces over the hours that followed, that this was the Vitali estate on the north shore of the lake, a fortress of stone and glass behind iron gates, that Lucian had carried her here himself, while the sirens wailed somewhere in the dark, that a doctor had looked at the cut on her cheek and pronounced it nothing, and that when she went looking for answers, she found them delivered in the flat, certain voice of a man who did not expect to be argued with. She found Lucian in a vast kitchen with the gray lake stretching beyond the windows, and she did not bother with pleasantries. "I want to go home," she said. "My apartment, my things, my job at the restaurant. I want to go back to my life." Lucian looked up from the coffee he was not drinking, and there was no cruelty in his face. Only that immovable calm that was somehow worse. "Your apartment is gone," he said. Nora stared at him. "What do you mean gone?" "I bought out your lease," he said, as simply as another man might mention the weather. "My people cleared it yesterday. Your things are in storage, all of them, nothing lost. The place was a glass box on a bad street, with a lock a child could break, and now the people who came into my restaurant last night know your face, and that means it is not safe, and so it is done. And you will not be going back to the flowers either," he added, before she could speak. "You do not need to stand in that room arranging other people's tables anymore. Whatever they were paying you, consider it finished." Nora felt something hot and furious rise in her, a rage all the sharper for the exhaustion underneath it. "You can't do that," she said, her voice shaking. "You can't just erase my whole life because someone tried to hurt you." "They tried to hurt my mother," Lucian corrected quietly, "and you put yourself in front of her, and that makes you a target now, whether you chose it or not. I do not leave the people who matter walking around unprotected for the pleasure of pretending they are free." Nora gripped the edge of the marble island until her knuckles went white, and she wanted to scream at him, wanted to tell him that a cage lined with cashmere was still a cage, that he did not get to decide the shape of her days, as though she were another asset to be secured. But before she could get any of it out, she caught sight of Isadora, seated at the far end of the island over an untouched bowl of oatmeal, watching the two of them with wide, frightened eyes, her hands gripping the edge of her stool, feeling the aggression in the room she could not hear. And the fight drained out of Nora, not because she had surrendered, but because she would not do this in front of the old woman, and so she swallowed it down and did the only thing she could think of to reclaim even an inch of ground. "Say good morning to your mother," she said. Lucian blinked, thrown off his stride. "What?" "Say good morning to her. In her language," Nora said, holding his gaze and refusing to drop it. "You do not get to lock me in this house and erase everything I had, and then ignore the woman I took a hit for. She is sitting right there, and she is terrified. Say it." A muscle worked in Lucian's jaw, and the two guards by the patio doors suddenly found the floor tiles fascinating, and for a long, dangerous moment Nora did not know which way it would break. Then, slowly, Lucian turned away from Nora and toward his mother, and he crossed the kitchen to where Isadora sat gripping her stool, and he did something that made both of the guards go carefully blind to the moment. He lowered himself down until his face was level with hers, until this man who towered over everyone and everything in his world was kneeling on his own kitchen floor looking up at his frightened mother, and then he raised his hands. They were still stiff, still clumsy, the same blunt-scarred fingers that had fought him for weeks, but he had clearly been practicing more than Nora knew, because the sign came slowly and imperfectly, but whole. "Good morning," he shaped, and then he pointed to himself, and touched his chest and managed the rest of it. "It is me. I am here." Isadora's breath caught. Her masked face could not do what another face would have done, but her eyes filled and softened, and one corner of her mouth lifted in the lopsided way that was the closest her stilled features could come to a smile, and she lifted her own trembling hands and answered him, "Good morning, my son." And Lucian stayed there kneeling a moment longer than he needed to, just looking at her, before he rose again to his full height and turned back to Nora with an expression that dared her to make anything of it. She did not. She only looked at him and felt the ground shift under her once more, because she had come into that kitchen ready to hate him with the clean, uncomplicated hatred of a prisoner for a jailer, and he had gone and knelt on the floor to say good morning to his mother in a language he had bled to learn, and it was so much harder to hate a man once you had seen him do a thing like that. "Eat your breakfast, Nora," he said, and his voice had dropped an octave into something almost gentle. "We have people coming to reinforce the perimeter at noon. Stay away from the windows." And then he walked out, and Nora stood watching the doorway he had gone through, and understood with a sinking certainty that the lock on her gilded cage was not made of iron, or of threats at all, but of exactly this, the fragile human thing she kept forcing him to show her. In the days that followed, she learned the rhythms of the great cold house, learned that Lucian slept no more than a few hours at a stretch, and paced the library above her room in the dark, learned that he vanished for long stretches into a world she was not permitted to see, and returned with a tightness around his eyes that took hours to fade. And it was on one of those sleepless nights, unable to rest herself, that she went wandering the silent halls for a glass of water, and passed the cracked door of his study, and stopped. Because she saw him. He was sitting at his desk with a laptop open before him, its glow the only light in the room, and on the screen, a pair of hands was demonstrating a sign, slowly, over and over, and Lucian was copying it, his own hands rising and falling, failing, resetting, trying again, his brow furrowed in fierce concentration. And Nora watched from the darkness of the hall, as the most dangerous man in the city sat alone at 3 a.m, drilling the same small motion again and again like a schoolboy, missing it, and then getting it, and pausing to stare at his own hand the way he had that first night, and then starting the next word. She saw the frustration in the set of his shoulders when his fingers would not obey, saw him flex them and shake them out, and bend back to the screen with a stubbornness that had nothing to do with power over anyone else, and everything to do with a want so private he had hidden it even from her. And she pressed her back against the cool wall of the hallway, and found that her heart was pounding, and her eyes were stinging, because this frightened her more than his weapon ever had, more than the locked gates or the men with guns, or the vow he had made over her bleeding face. A cruel man she could have hated safely from behind the bars of her cage. But a man who taught himself tenderness in secret in the middle of the night, for no audience, for no advantage, only so that he might one day speak to his mother without a translator standing between them. That was a far more dangerous thing, because no wall in the world could keep a woman safe from a man like that. The storm came in off the lake on a Thursday, throwing sheets of sleet against the reinforced windows, and the house was dead quiet save for the drumming of it, when the door from the garage slammed open hard enough to shutter the wall. Nora had been in the kitchen warming milk she could not sleep without, and she froze with the pan in her hand, and then Lucian came through the doorway, and she dropped it. He was leaning heavily against the frame, his charcoal coat torn at the shoulder, his white shirt beneath it soaked through and darkened in a way that had nothing to do with the rain, and when he stepped into the overhead light, she saw the wrongness of how he held himself, one arm clamped tight to his side, his breathing shallow and uneven, his face the color of ash. She reached him before she had decided to move, catching his weight as his knees began to give, and eased him down to the kitchen floor with her own strength buckling under the size of him, and he let her, which frightened her more than anything, because a man like Lucian did not let anyone take his weight. "No hospital," he ground out through his teeth as she pressed her hands against his side and felt the wet heat there. "No hospital. They have a doctor coming. He is on his way." And she wanted to argue, wanted to scream for an ambulance, but she saw the certainty in his fading eyes, and understood that in his world a hospital meant questions, and questions meant enemies. And so she did the only thing she could. She stripped off her cardigan and balled it up, and pressed it hard against the wound to slow the bleeding, the way she had once learned in a first aid class a lifetime ago. And he groaned low in his throat, and his head fell back against the cabinet. "Stay with me," she said, though she knew he could hear her, leaning over him. "Keep your eyes open. Look at me. The doctor is coming. Just breathe." And his eyes found hers, glassy and unfocused, and for a while he only breathed, ragged and slow, while she kept the pressure steady, and her own hands shook. And then his right hand came up, fumbling, searching, and closed around her wrist, and she thought at first he was only trying to hold on, until she felt his fingers begin to move against the inside of her wrist, clumsy and weak and unmistakable, shaping something, and she went very still, because he was signing. In his delirium, with his strength pouring out of him, and his mind slipping loose from its moorings, the language he had drilled in secret in the dark had risen out of him without thought, the way a man reverts in his last defenses to whatever lives deepest in him, and against the frantic beat of her pulse his failing hand formed the word "stay," and then, after a shuddering breath, the sign she had watched him practice against his own chest 100 times. "Please. Please." It was not a word she had ever expected from him in any language. This man who commanded and never asked, and to feel it pressed, trembling into her skin, while his blood soaked through her sweater, broke something in her that no threat and no cage had been able to touch. "I'm here," she said fiercely, bending until her forehead nearly touched his. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Do you hear me? I'm staying." And whether he understood the words or only felt them she could not say, but the tension went out of his searching hand, and it settled over hers where it pressed the wound, and his cracked lips moved. "Good," he breathed, "barely sound at all, because if you ran I would only have to come and find you." And then his eyes slid closed, and the door burst open, and 3 men with medical bags rushed in and pushed her aside, and Nora sat back against the cabinets and watched them work over him for what felt like hours, watched the pile of ruined cloth grow beside them, and looked down at last at her own 2 hands stained rust brown and drying tight against her skin. And in that moment, sitting on the cold marble floor of a killer's kitchen with his blood on her hands, and his plea still ghosting against her wrist, she felt the last of her clean, bright certainties dissolve. She was not a captive anymore, not really, and that was the terrible part. A captive could keep her soul intact behind the bars. But she had knelt in the dark and pressed her own body's warmth into a dying man, to keep him in the world. She had promised she would stay. and she had meant it, and she understood then how the thing was truly done, how a person was truly caught, not with fear, never with fear, but with the unbearable pull of pity turning without permission into something that had no name she was willing to speak. 6 months later, the private room at the Cecilia smelled the same as it always had, of white flowers and cigar smoke, but almost everything else had changed, and Nora walked through those heavy oak doors not in a threadbare dress with a florist's apron, but in tailored charcoal that fit her as though it had been made for her, which it had, her copper hair swept up, a small diamond catching the light at her ear, and the men who lingered in the outer rooms lowered their eyes and inclined their heads as she passed, murmuring a respectful greeting, because she was not the invisible girl who changed the water anymore. She was family now, and everyone in that world understood exactly what that meant. Inside room number 7, there were no lieutenants tonight, no papers, no low talk of shipments, only Lucian and Isadora waiting at the long table, and Marco was not among them and never would be again, because the plot he had laid against his own aunt had cost him everything, in a family that forgave many things, but never a betrayal aimed at its own heart, and he had been sent far away to a corner of their world from which he would not be returning. Lucian rose when Nora entered, moving a little stiffly still on his left side where the wound had healed into a pale seam, and he did not reach for a translator, and did not speak a word aloud. He simply lifted his hands, and they moved now with a slow, sure fluency that months of stubborn secret practice had earned him, and he signed to his mother that dinner had arrived, and Isadora, watching her son's hands shape the words directly to her at last with no one standing in between, gathered herself with the effort that every sentence now cost her, and answered him in turn, and it took her a while, and Lucian waited the way he had learned to wait, and when she finished she had told him, whole and unhurried and meant with her entire heart, that he was a good son, and that she was proud of the man he had become, and Lucian bowed his head. And then Nora did a thing she had not done in almost 2 years except in service of others. She did it for herself, freely and without the old flinch of grief. She lifted her own hands and signed, and she felt no ghost rise to accuse her, saw not her father's wounded face, but something like his forgiveness in the gesture itself, because she understood at last that she had not betrayed him by putting the language away, and she did not honor him by hurting over it. She honored him by using it, by refusing to let another soul sit alone in the silence the way he once had, and the debt she had carried for 2 years, the last cruel words her hands had ever spoken to him, was not erased but was answered, paid forward into this room, into this family, into the old woman across the table who had waited so patiently for her to be ready. Isadora reached into the folds of her shawl and drew out something small and pressed it into Nora's palm, and Nora looked down and found a single dried blossom, brittle and yellowed with the years, an orange blossom kept for nearly 30 years since the last night a great haul had risen to its feet for her. And the old woman closed Nora's fingers around it, and then lifted one trembling hand and laid it against Nora's cheek, her stilled face soft with everything it could not otherwise show, and Nora understood that the frozen body reaching out across all that distance to touch her was itself the truest language of love there was. Lucian watched them, and then he reached across the table and set his warm hand over Nora's, and he signed to her, clumsy still in this one private thing, though fluent now in so much else, 2 small words shaped just for her. True, he made, touching his chin, and then mine, drawing his hand to his chest, and Nora looked at him, this dangerous man who ran half a city and could not sleep, and had knelt on a kitchen floor to learn tenderness. And she understood the thing she had been circling for 6 months, that of the 3 people in that room he was the only one who was not truly free, bound as he was to his empire, and his blood, and the long dark ledger of everything he had done to hold it all together, while the 2 silent women beside him, the one who could not hear, and the one who had buried her voice, were freer in the only way that finally mattered, free to feel, free to forgive, free to love without counting the cost. And so it was not really a cage she had walked into after all, but the one open room in the whole of his locked and guarded world, and she lifted her hands and signed the words back to him, true and mine, And it was not surrender, it was a choice, made with her eyes wide open, and for the first time since her father had left her, she was not afraid of the silence. She had made a home inside it. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. And if it moved you even a little, then please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and to like and share this video so that you can keep listening to many more heartfelt stories with us every single day. We would love to know how this story made you feel, so please leave a comment and share with us whatever rose from deep within your heart as you listened, because your voice is the reason we keep telling these stories. Until then, we wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every ordinary day. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.